No one walks into a pawn shop expecting to find hell. But that's exactly what happened to me on a cold Thursday night. The biting wind outside seemed to want to push me away, but something about those rusted doors pulled me in, an odd, irresistible magnetism. As I stepped inside, the cold, dense air wrapped around me, as if the shop had its own atmosphere, detached from everything outside. The place was bathed in an uncomfortable dimness, where shadows danced on the walls with a ghostly rhythm. I glanced over the objects scattered on smoky shelves and behind fogged-up glass. Relics from other times, as if the shop were a depot for lost souls, a sanctuary for things that never found their place in the world. But then, something caught my attention. An old board covered in dark cloths sat hidden in an almost forgotten corner. Like a whisper in the darkness, it called to me. I walked toward it without thinking, my footsteps echoing as if the shop wanted me to leave, and yet at the same time, it beckoned me closer. The board was covered, but there was something unsettling about the way the cloth was draped, as if it had been waiting for me. A strange feeling washed over me, like I had seen it before, like I knew it had something to tell me, something I didn't want to hear, but somehow needed to. I lifted the cloth, and what I saw was far more than just a simple board. Every piece, every detail seemed to possess a life of its own, a nearly tangible presence that pierced through me. The air around me felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. My fingers trembled as they touched the aged wooden surface, and it was in that moment I realized I was no longer alone. The hell I had never expected to find wasn't some distant place. It was here, all around me, in every object, in every suffocating breath. The pawn shop wasn't just a warehouse of lost goods, but a portal to the unknown, where time and space blurred. And as I looked down at that board, I knew I had been drawn into something far greater than I could understand, something I could no longer walk away from. The shop owner, an old man with sunken eyes and a crooked smile, didn't try to convince me to buy it. He simply stared at me, as if he knew something I hadn't yet understood. His gaze was piercing, distant, as though he was looking past me, into a place where the rules of the ordinary world didn't apply. And then, in a low, drawn-out voice, almost a whisper, he said, "If you take it, play alone. But never look into the mirror at 3 in the morning." Those words hung in the air like a suffocating warning. I laughed, skeptical. What nonsense, I thought. The old man was just trying to add some mystical flair to his pawn shop. I'm not one of those superstitious people, I told myself. I took the board, paid without hesitation, and left, just like that. Today, I'd give anything to have never brought it home. The board sat in a dark corner of my apartment, visible, yet insignificant. For weeks, I thought it had just been another strange experience, one more story to tell, until one night, after a long and tiring day, I found myself alone in the quiet early hours, the faint glow of dawn barely touching the room. Something in the silence pulled me toward the corner where the board rested. I sat in front of it. Curiosity consumed me. What could be so special? The old man had been wrong. There was nothing extraordinary about this simple object. But as I began to move the pieces, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the board. It was a growing feeling that something was watching my every move. Something that hadn't been there before. The silence felt heavier, as if time itself had been suspended. Midnight passed, and something drew my gaze toward the mirror in the far corner of the room. I knew I shouldn't, but the old man's warning only made the pull stronger, almost irresistible. I stood up and walked toward the mirror. The reflection was mine, but my eyes were different. There was a shadow, something that shouldn't have been there. Before I could understand, a whisper sliced through the air. The same whisper as the old man's, now in my ear. "You looked. Now there's no turning back." The mirror, once just a reflection, now seemed to be pulling me in. I tried to step away, but an invisible force held me there, trapped. The glass began to tremble, and the shadows within it stretched, as if trying to escape. In the reflection, my eyes were no longer my own. The smile I saw was crooked, twisted, and in that moment, I finally understood. What the old man said hadn't been a warning. It had been a curse. Today, I'd give anything to have never taken that board. Because now, every night at 3 in the morning, the mirror calls to me, and I can no longer look away. The board was both beautiful and terrifying. Its contours were elegant, the dark wood masterfully polished, but there was something about it that sent a chill down my spine, as if its beauty was merely a facade, hiding what it truly was. The symbols engraved along the edges were enigmatic, like an ancient language, something I had never seen before. They seemed to pulse faintly in the candlelight, and with each closer look, they appeared to shift, as if they existed in another dimension, beyond the reach of human understanding. The pieces, made of black glass, were perfectly shaped but carried a strange, almost ethereal gleam. When I touched them, I felt a coldness that wasn't natural, a sensation that the glass was not merely glass, but something much denser, more solid, something that didn't belong in this world. The purple candle, already partially spent, stood beside the board, its melted wax forming almost hypnotic shapes around it. Its scent was sweet, but with a bitter edge, as if time itself had soaked into it, infusing it with something more than just wax. And then, in the center of the board, in fine, almost faded letters, I saw what made my throat tighten: Speculum Veritas, Mirror of Truth. The name hit me like a blow, and I couldn't explain why. Something in those words echoed inside me as if they carried a weight far greater than their literal meaning. Mirror of Truth. What did it mean? A physical mirror? Or something deeper? Something more terrifying? Truth, I thought, has never been easy to face. Who seeks truth without fearing what it might reveal? Suddenly, the air around me grew heavier, as if space itself had compressed. I knew something was wrong, that the board was no ordinary object, but curiosity spoke louder. The letters at the center mesmerized me, and I couldn't take my eyes off them. Something deep inside told me the game had already begun, even if I hadn't made the first move. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't just a game. It wasn't about winning or losing. Speculum Veritas wasn't a mere metaphor. It was an invitation. An invitation to look, to reveal, to confront. And as I stared at the board, a voice whispered in my mind, like a presence I couldn't see, but knew was there, waiting patiently. Do you want to know the truth? I got home with a frozen body and a racing heart, as if something were crawling inside me, something I couldn't see, but that was pulling me. When I closed the door behind me, silence overtook the house, heavy and dense. The air felt colder than usual, thicker. I knew what I was about to do, and despite all my doubts, an invisible force pushed me forward, pushed me toward that moment. I followed the instructions that came with the board without questioning anything else. I placed the board at the center of the table. Beside it, the purple candle still burned, its flame trembling as if it had a life of its own. In front of it, I placed the large mirror, an old one I had never used. It reflected my image, but it also seemed to reflect something more, something hidden in the shadows dancing along the edges of the glass. Everything was in place, exactly as it should be. The board, with its ancient symbols, seemed to pulse under the candlelight, and I could feel, deep within me, that there was no turning back. All that remained now was to wait. The wall clock made its first tick, echoing through the silent house. The sound stretched through the air like a reminder of what was coming. I looked into the mirror, trying to stay calm, trying not to think about what that hour, the dead hour, really meant. The clock continued ticking, and with each second, the space around me seemed to grow tighter, smaller. I knew something would happen at 3 a.m. The leaflet had been clear about that. The dead hour. The hour when the veil between worlds thins, and what is hidden comes forth. Fear was spreading through me, but so was an insatiable curiosity, a need to go further, to understand what was happening. But as time passed, the atmosphere began to shift. The house, which usually felt safe and warm, now felt like a prison. Shadows stretched across the walls, and I could swear the air was getting heavier, more charged. It was almost 3. The sound of my heartbeat was the only thing I could hear, pounding loudly in my chest. The mirror in front of me reflected a distorted version of myself, and I wondered for a brief moment if I should go through with it. But then the clock struck 3 crows. It was as if the air froze. The room grew darker, more oppressive. The purple candle, once so steady, now flickered, its flame wavering as if fighting to stay lit. I looked into the mirror, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move inside it. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't my reflection. Not anymore. It was as if something else was being reflected. A shadow, a figure stretching, contorting, trying to break free from within the glass. Then the voice came, faint, whispering from the depths of my mind, but clear enough to send a shiver through my body. "You asked for the truth. Now face it." That word, truth, echoed in my mind. I tried to move, tried to look away from the mirror, but something held me there. Something wouldn't let me turn away. The truth was right in front of me, in every warped reflection, in every shadow that seemed to take shape. And in that moment, I knew. The mirror wasn't just reflecting what stood before it. It was reflecting what I didn't want to see, what I feared, what I had tried to ignore. But it was already too late. When the hand struck the hour, the silence in the house felt dense, as if time itself had hesitated, suspended in the air. The ticking of the clock ceased to exist, and all that remained was the weight of the darkness stretching along the walls. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, as if the house had swallowed all the oxygen. The candle's flame, which had burned with an unsettling calm until then, began to tremble, flickering as if something invisible were watching it, as if something were breathing nearby, close enough that the breeze of its breath made the flame waver. I was frozen, staring at the board where each symbol seemed to come alive. The marker, shaped like an eye, sat there, waiting for my hand. Its edges were delicate, as if made of glass, but something inside it reflected the candlelight in a strange, distorted way. The eye was empty, and yet it seemed to be staring back at me, as if it knew what I was about to do. My body was tense, every muscle stretched like a wire about to snap. And still, I knew there was no turning back. The board, the symbols, the candle. Everything had been waiting for this moment. With trembling hands, I placed the marker at the center of the board, exactly where it was meant to be, just as the instructions had said. The board seemed to warm beneath my fingers, not from the wood itself, but from something deeper, something from within. I took a deep breath, feeling the thick air pressing in around me, and then, without further hesitation, I rolled the die. The sound of it rolling was absurdly loud in the silence of the house. It spun, bounced, and finally came to a stop. The answer was there, etched on the faces of the die, but something inside me already knew this roll was only the beginning. The board was no longer just in front of me, it felt like it was inside me, filling the space with growing tension. And then, the space around me began to change. The shadows on the walls stretched, outlining the shapes of familiar objects as if trying to consume everything. The candle, though still flickering, now seemed to illuminate a part of the room I no longer recognized. The air grew even heavier, and in the corner of my eye, the shadows moved, sliding along the walls as if they were entities in their own right, taking form. When I finally looked back at the board, I felt a pressure at my temples, a dull ache. The eye-shaped marker was no longer where I had placed it. It was moving, sliding slowly across the wooden surface as if it were alive, as if it were making decisions that were no longer mine. The die, once still, now spun gently, reflecting the candlelight with a strange glow, as if it had absorbed something from beyond this world. I knew there was no escape now. This was no longer just a game. It was unfolding before me, and I, like a puppet, could only follow each step it dictated. Every movement on the board felt heavier, deeper. I could feel it. Something was being revealed, something that couldn't be ignored. The truth was beginning to surface, and there was no turning back. With my heart pounding harder each second, I looked at the marker, that empty, penetrating eye, and I knew the answer I was seeking was there. But as I stared into the mirror on the board, I realized maybe I wasn't ready for the truth it wanted to show me. It landed on an odd number. That meant I could ask a question. The adrenaline rushing through my veins made it feel like time had slowed down. Yet, at the same time, everything seemed to be accelerating. The board was completely silent, and the candle, though flickering, had stabilized, casting light on the scene in a strange, almost supernatural way. The air was thick, as if the very atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Stammering, my throat tight with fear and curiosity, I whispered, "Is someone here with me?" The question came out almost involuntarily, an impulse, an urgent need to understand what was happening, to make sense of what was unfolding around me. I expected a response, a confirmation, something to reassure me that this was just a game, a prank. But what happened next chilled me to the bone. The mirror, which until then had reflected my image, suddenly darkened, as if an internal mist had overtaken it. The candlelight seemed to distort, as though being pulled into the surface of the glass. An intense cold flooded the room, and the air, once heavy, now felt unbreathable, as if everything had compressed, creating a crushing pressure around me. I blinked, unable to believe what I was seeing. The mirror was no longer simply reflecting the room. It was now engulfed in a dense darkness, something that seemed to move within it, as if the glass itself were alive, transforming before my eyes. Fear began to take hold of me, a deep, visceral sense that whatever was behind that mirror was not meant to be seen. And yet, I couldn't look away. That's when I realized, with a cold jolt of terror, that I was no longer alone. Behind me, reflected in the darkened mirror, there was a figure standing still. It didn't move, but it was there, undeniably present. I couldn't make out clear details, only a shadow that twisted erratically, as if made of smoke or mist. But it was enough to know this wasn't a trick of the light or some projected shape. It was something, or someone. Panic froze me in place. I tried to turn, to see it with my own eyes. But the figure wasn't physically behind me. It was only in the reflection, motionless, watching me in a way I couldn't understand. There was no face, not even a clear outline. It was like a being made of darkness, a presence that stretched and shifted within the mirror itself. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. Something about the figure's presence paralyzed me, like an insect caught in the web of an invisible spider. The only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat, wild, erratic, pounding so loudly it seemed to fill the entire space. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what it was. But one thing was certain. The answer to my question was no longer a distant possibility. It was there behind me, reflected in that mirror. An invisible, unknowable presence that had answered in a way I could never have imagined. "Yes, you are not alone." The presence seemed to whisper, though it used no words. And in that moment, I understood. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. I turned quickly, my body reacting before my mind had time to process the terror taking hold of me. I looked behind me, searching for confirmation that it had all just been a trick of my imagination, a play of light and shadow. But what I found was absolute emptiness. Nothing. Just the heavy silence of the house. The air felt stagnant, as if the space itself were waiting for something, waiting for me. But then I looked back at the mirror. It was still there, the shadow, faceless, shapeless, just a presence, a dark, distorted silhouette hovering in the glass, motionless, fixed directly on me. There were no eyes, no human features, only a deep void, as if the mirror were a window into something that wasn't meant to be seen, something beyond all logical explanation. My throat went dry. Panic gripped my chest and a wave of cold sweat ran down my spine. I tried to breathe, but the air wouldn't come. The shadow's reflection didn't change. It didn't move, didn't react to my frantic gaze. It just stared, its presence denser than any physical substance, more solid than any human being. A profound emptiness took hold inside me, as if this figure somehow knew more about me than I did myself. In that moment, I understood. The game had truly begun, and I was no longer in control. What I had started when I placed the marker on the board, when I rolled the die, was something far beyond my expectations, beyond my understanding. I had crossed an invisible line, one that now bound me to rules I could no longer deny. The mirror was no longer a simple object. It was a door, a passage, and what waited on the other side was not something I was prepared to face. I wanted to step back, to stop everything, but some invisible force held me there, trapped in front of that reflection. The shadow in the mirror wasn't just an image. It was a threat, a promise, that by looking at it, I had made a commitment to something far greater, something ancient. I tried to speak, to say anything, but the words failed me. Only silence remained. And then a wave of foreboding swept over me. It wasn't just a reflection. The faceless figure felt my presence, as though it could read my thoughts, as though it was patiently waiting for me to take the next step. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. The mirror was no longer reflecting what stood in front of it. It was reflecting what was inside me. And that void, that shadow, was the most terrifying thing I had ever encountered. I wasn't in control anymore. On the second round, the board vibrated slightly, as if preparing for something. The sense that this was no longer just a game intensified, and every move I made felt like another piece in a puzzle I couldn't grasp. The room was silent, but the weight in the air grew heavier with each passing second, as if an invisible presence were drawing closer, watching. I rolled the die again. It spun across the board, its sound muffled by the tension that filled the room. It stopped. Another odd number. The rule was clear. I had to ask a question. But before I could form one, something happened. The room seemed to narrow, as though space itself were being shaped by an external force. And then, without my prompting, the voice came. Not from the board, but from somewhere behind me. It was damp, muffled, as though it came from inside the wall, trapped within the house's very structure. The voice didn't sound human, and yet it was impossible to ignore. "Are you alone?" The question echoed in my ears with a weight that made me shiver. It was simple, but there was something deeply wrong with it. Something I couldn't name, but that made my heart pound harder, faster, as if each beat was a reminder that I was no longer safe. I tried to respond, but the voice, distorted and unexpected, left me frozen. The doubt crept in instantly. Who or what was really asking? And more importantly, why? Fear surged through me like a storm, and I knew I had to answer. I didn't know what would happen if I lied, but I didn't want to find out. So, with a trembling voice, barely more than a breath, I whispered, "Yes." The word slipped from my lips before I could stop it. It sounded false, even to me, but it was the only thing I could manage. I didn't know what else might come out of my mouth, or if anything beyond that single word was expected. The air grew thicker, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I knew something was wrong, but it was too late to take it back. The silence that followed was deafening. The board, once just a strange object, now felt alive, and the shadow hanging over the room felt more real than ever. The candle flickered harder, its flame sputtering, and the shadows on the wall seemed to stretch toward me, as if trying to reach inside. I knew something had changed. The voice in the wall was waiting, and I had the distinct feeling that my answer hadn't been just any word. It had been a key, something I didn't fully understand, but that had somehow brought me closer to something I didn't want to find. The game somehow was now controlling me, not the other way around. And the truth was, in that moment, I no longer knew if I was truly alone. The piece moved on its own, sliding across the board as if it had a will of its own, as if obeying a force that wasn't mine. It stopped slowly on a square, marked with a stitched mouth, the thick, irregular thread crossing the wood in a grotesque manner. My skin crawled. It was a symbol I hadn't noticed before, and the mere fact that it was there, at that moment, made my stomach churn. What was that? What did it mean? Something inside me already knew I shouldn't continue, but fear was no longer enough to stop me. The silence in the room intensified. The candle flickered erratically, as if unable to contain the growing pressure in the air. I was about to move another piece when something strange happened. The mirror blinked. Like a glass screen cracking, it snapped with a muffled sound, almost imperceptible, but I knew it wasn't just the flame wavering. The light in the room subtly changed, distorting everything around me, and the reflection in the mirror began to fragment. I felt a strange sensation, as if the mirror was warping, trying to swallow me. And then, the image returned. It was me there. Me, reflected on the glass surface. But something was terribly wrong. My eyes were completely black, as if darkness had taken over them from the inside out, with no shine, no soul. They were dead. And then, the smile, not my smile, but something distorted, sadistic, a smile that couldn't have come from me. It widened as if trying to escape my face, an impossible, grotesque, emotionless smile. It was something that shouldn't be there, like a deformed caricature of what I was. My heart raced, and I took a step back, my body tense and paralyzed by the sight. The image wasn't just a reflection, it was watching me. There was no movement, but I knew that version of me wasn't just an illusion. It was as if that being, with the dead eyes and macabre smile, was more present than I was. I tried to look away from the mirror, but I couldn't. I was trapped. The image on the glass didn't disappear, didn't fade. It was there, as real as I was. The stitched mouth on the board's symbol, that sinister mouth, seemed to slowly open, as if waiting for me to make the next move. Or perhaps it was I who was being manipulated. The feeling that I had lost control over everything, over the game itself, enveloped me in a way I had never felt before. I knew the mirror was no longer just an object reflecting reality. It was a door, a portal to something much darker, something that had no intention of letting me leave. And the smile of my image, there in the mirror, never stopped growing. The rule was clear: never stop before the 6th round. But as the minutes dragged on, what once seemed like a simple board game had turned into something far more sinister. I no longer knew if I was the one playing or if the game was using me. The feeling of being manipulated, pulled into an endless abyss, was inescapable. Each move no longer felt like my own choice, but an impulse, an invisible force dictating my actions. The board, the symbols, the mirror, all of it was blending into a spiral of terror I could no longer control. My hands were sweating. The cold in the room was sharp, cutting, but I couldn't stop. The game was underway, and I no longer knew how or why it had started. But something inside me told me I couldn't go back. I looked at the die, the small wooden cube with its imprecise numbers, and with a nearly automatic motion, I prepared for the next roll. But something happened. The die slipped from my hand, hitting the table with a muffled sound. It rolled for a moment, as if trying to resist the fate being imposed on it. And then, with a dry clack, it hit the floor. Number 1. The number stared back at me like a sentence, as if the universe had given me an irreversible command. Once again, I was at the mercy of something I no longer understood. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts, which felt on the edge of collapse. There were no more choices, no more alternatives. The board stared back at me. The mirror reflected a version of myself I no longer recognized, and the pressure building inside me was unbearable. And then, as if there were no other option, a question slipped from my lips, unthinking, unfiltered. "What do you want from me?" The voice came out trembling, desperate, but it was the only thing I could still ask. The game was no longer about winning or losing. It wasn't about who would come out victorious. Now it was about what was happening to me, what was happening to my very reality. The silence in the room grew tighter, as if the air had become dense, almost solid. The board didn't move, but the candle, already flickering, suddenly went out, plunging the room into deeper darkness. The mirror before me flickered once more, as if something on the other side was stirring, something that didn't want to be seen. I waited, my heart pounding, my hands drenched in sweat. And then the answer came. It wasn't a word, it wasn't an audible voice. It was a sensation, a deep tremor that ran down my spine, as if the very room were vibrating. Somewhere deep inside me, I knew the answer was simple, but terrifying. What it wanted from me was my soul, my essence. It wanted me to surrender completely, to be swallowed by the game, by the force now dominating my reality. I no longer had control. The die, the board, the mirror, all of it had woven into a web I couldn't escape. The truth was clear. But the price of knowing it was something I still didn't fully understand. What it wanted from me was more than I could give. And in that moment, I realized the game wasn't about winning. It was about being consumed. And I was already lost. The mirror responded with images. First, I saw my room. The faint light of dawn filtering through the curtain, the unmade bed, the familiar stillness that always brought comfort. But as the contours of the image faded and reorganized, something began to change. In the reflection, I saw my body lying in the bed, motionless, as if in a deep sleep. But the strangest part was that I knew I wasn't there. I was awake, sitting at the table, playing that damn game, feeling the weight of each move, the tension stretching through every second. I blinked, trying to understand what was happening. What was that? An illusion? A projection of my mind? It couldn't be real. I was right here, playing, feeling the board, the die, the weight of the candle burning out before me. I was awake, wasn't I? But the images continued, relentlessly. The sight of my body in bed seemed as real as I did, sitting there in that room. I saw myself lying still, eyes closed, as if lost in a deep sleep, in a state of unconsciousness. And then, the worst happened. The mirror's image didn't stop at the reflection of my body. It began to expand, distorting reality, blurring the line between what I saw and what was actually happening. I saw my face, calm, peaceful, as if nothing strange had occurred. But in the back of my mind, a question pulsed, an idea that seemed to grow with every passing second. What if I never woke up? It was as if the game, in some way, was showing me something I didn't want to see. The image of me lying in bed was too clear, too vivid, as if that was the true reality, and what I was living now was a projection, a fantasy created by the game itself. I no longer knew what was real and what was fiction. The board, the candle, the mirror, everything seemed to merge into a plot where I was just a piece, moved by forces I couldn't comprehend. The mirror didn't offer answers. It only showed me more questions, more fragments of a truth I wasn't ready to understand. And the feeling that overtook me was one of absolute helplessness. I no longer knew if I was awake or if this was just another nightmare disguised as reality. Then a soft voice, almost imperceptible, could be heard, coming from somewhere inside me, inside the mirror, inside the game. It wasn't an external voice. It was mine. You never woke up. The shock was immediate. The words resonated in my mind like a distant scream, a revelation that burned deep in my consciousness. I was no longer in control. Maybe I never had been. The line between sleep and wakefulness, between the real and the unreal, was disintegrating before me. What I saw, what I felt, it could all be a lie. The game hadn't just consumed me, it had shaped my very perception of existence, trapping me in a prison of mirrors, where every answer only created more questions. And I was stuck there, lost, no longer knowing which was reality and which was fantasy. I never woke up, and perhaps I never would. On the fourth roll, the die rolled with a muffled sound, stopping abruptly. 6. The final number, the one indicating that the game was about to reach a point of no return. No question was asked. There was no need for words. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, as if the very air was being compressed around me. The board remained inert, its pieces no longer moved, and the candle, which had previously trembled with the presence of something invisible, was now static, as if it was waiting for the right moment to disappear. I looked at the mirror, a sense of fear settling in my throat. Something was wrong. The reflection, which had once been a faithful copy of the room, was now starting to distort. A dark stain appeared on the glass, spreading slowly, as if something was seeping in from within. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, what I saw was even more impossible. Something began to drip from the mirror. It wasn't just a stain. It was a dense, dark substance, almost like paint, but with a sinister shine that reminded me of something far more terrible. It was as if the mirror was bleeding, but this wasn't ordinary blood. No, it was thicker, more viscous, as if the glass itself was overflowing with something that shouldn't be there. something not from the real world. The substance dripped down the edges of the mirror, slowly pooling on the floor, forming small droplets that collected in a thick, dark puddle. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on that grotesque flow, unable to understand what was happening. The smell that began to fill the room was what made me step back. It was strong, pungent, unmistakable. The smell of iron, of something metallic, as if the air was saturated with old blood, with something rotten and forgotten. The environment around me seemed to be deteriorating, the air heavy and thick, as if time was slowing down, stagnating. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me back. The reflection in the mirror didn't move, but the dark substance kept dripping, more and more, flooding the floor around the mirror. I couldn't look away. I was trapped, absorbed by that vision of indescribable horror. With every second, the smell of iron grew stronger, more nauseating, and the sound of the substance dripping, the noise it made as it hit the floor, seemed to echo in my head. It was as if everything around me was dissolving, as if the mirror was pulling the very space I was in. What was happening? What did this mean? I didn't know, and the answer seemed farther and farther away, more impossible to reach. I only knew one thing. The game no longer had control. It was consuming me. And that was no longer a game. The candle flickered, its wavering flame turning almost blue, a cold color that didn't seem natural. The air around it seemed to distort, as if it were absorbing the light, extinguishing the last essence of warmth in the room. The board, which had until then remained inert, began to pulse softly, as if it had a life of its own, reacting somehow to my presence. The wood vibrated, and the pieces, which had been perfectly aligned before, now seemed slightly displaced, as if they were trying to move on their own. I couldn't take my eyes off the board. The game was becoming more intense, more real, as if it were the only thing that existed in that moment. The feeling of being pulled into it was overwhelming. I wanted to stop. I wanted to abandon it. But something, an invisible force, kept me there, trapped in that chair, in that room, in this insane game. With trembling hands, I rolled the die for the 5th time, the sound of the wooden cube hitting the board seeming to echo in my head more than in the room. It rolled and stopped. 5. The rule was clear. 5 meant a question, and I was about to ask mine. But it wasn't a choice. The question came straight from my mind, as if it had been drawn from a deep place, as if it had already been waiting to be said. There was no turning back. Have you ever seen your true face? The words escaped me like a sigh, but soon I realized that the answer was carrying something much heavier than I had imagined. I swallowed hard, the bitter taste of doubt rising in my throat. I didn't know why I had asked that question. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't normal. It wasn't a question you ask in any game. It wasn't a question you ask in any reality. The mirror in front of me seemed to darken even more, the glass now almost black, absorbing the light from the blue candle, as if it were an abyss waiting to swallow me. The room was silent, but there was something in the air, a growing tension that made my skin crawl. I was waiting for an answer, but at the same time, I feared hearing it. And then, the mirror lit up. Not in the way it should have, but in a terrible way, as if it were trying to reveal something I didn't want to see. A faint, cold light, as if emanating from deep within the glass itself. And suddenly, a strange sensation took over me. The sensation that what I was seeing in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. I was no longer the one standing in front of that glass. My breath became heavy, my heart racing. I saw my own face, but it wasn't my face. It was a version of me, something distorted, something I didn't recognize, as if it were a mask I had worn for so long that it had now become part of me. But I knew it wasn't real. It wasn't me. I was seeing something that should never have been seen. The figure in the mirror smiled, but it was a hollow smile, a soulless smile, as if it were mocking me, mocking what I was, mocking what I represented. The eyes, once mine, were now black, deep, expressionless. The mouth twisted grotesquely, as if it were tearing itself apart, revealing something behind the surface, Something dark, something older. I could barely breathe. The reflection in the mirror began to move. It was as if the image of myself was coming to life, rising from the surface of the glass. Something was wrong. I didn't want to look anymore, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I was hypnotized, trapped by that reflection, as if it had a power over me that I didn't understand. I no longer knew if I was the one playing or if the game was consuming me, leading me to a place where I would no longer be able to return. I had asked the question, but the answer now felt more like a sentence. I no longer had control. I no longer knew who I was, and the true face I was seeing in the mirror. Maybe it was me, or maybe it was the thing I feared most becoming. The reflection changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the image in the mirror began to distort. The weak light from the candle seemed to bend around the glass, creating shadows that played with the edges of my vision. What was once my face now appeared as a caricature, a disguised imitation of me. It was me, but it wasn't. The reflection no longer copied me exactly. There was something wrong with it, something subtle but impossible to ignore. The way my eyes blinked, the rhythm of my breathing, even the slight movement of my shoulders. Everything was a little off. Small mistakes, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to me, they were like screams in the middle of silence. I didn't blink that way. I didn't breathe like that. It was as if I were watching a puppet imitating me, with invisible strings awkwardly pulling its movements, forced and unnatural. Every gesture was a reflection of mine, but with something distorted, wrong, a reflection made by strange hands trying to imitate my essence, but never able to capture perfection. I could feel the discomfort in my own skin, the emptiness in the actions of the reflection, as if that being had no life of its own, as if it were trapped there, desperately trying to replicate me, but failing. And then, at the peak of that distortion, it smiled. It wasn't a genuine smile. It wasn't an expression I would recognize. It was a crooked, hollow smile, as if the reflection were mocking me, my fear, my helplessness. It wasn't the smile I would give. It wasn't the joy or comfort I used to show. It was a smile that only imitated that, unable to convey the true essence of emotion. I didn't smile. I was paralyzed, my gaze fixed on that being, trying to understand what was happening, trying to accept what was in front of me. The reflection stared at me, not even blinking, that smile widening with every passing second, while I just observed, unable to do anything. It was as if I were being watched by something that knew more about me than I knew myself, something that understood me so well it could imitate my soul. But that wasn't me. It was just a reflection, a shadow, a distortion of something that was once real. I was seeing a version of myself that was no longer mine, a version that could never be, but that still existed there, trapped between the limits of the glass and my mind. The feeling that I was losing control over my own identity intensified. I no longer knew if the reflection was imitating me, or if it was shaping me, defining me, without me being able to fight back. Its smile didn't stop, and with every second it became more real, more convincing, while I, before it, began to disappear. The sixth round arrived with a deafening silence, as if time itself had decided to take a pause, waiting for what would happen next. The die rolled with a strange calmness, its muffled sound as if the weight of its trajectory was laden with something incomprehensible. When it finally stopped, I saw what no one expected. It landed on a new space on the board, a space I knew hadn't been there before, an empty space that now seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. It was a square marked with a symbol that froze me inside, a turned hourglass, with the sand spilled out, stagnant, unable to follow its natural flow. It was the symbol of lost time, of the end, of immobility, something that indicated there was no turning back, that the cycle was complete. Before I could process what that meant, the candle, which had already flickered and wavered throughout the game, suddenly exploded. The flare was blinding, a purple light so intense it illuminated every corner of the room, reflecting off the walls, the mirror, the objects around me. The light seemed to vibrate in the air like a nearly tangible energy, and I had to blink quickly for my vision to return to normal. But when the explosion of light dissipated, the atmosphere was denser, more oppressive, and the feeling of being lost in a distorted reality grew stronger. The mirror, which had been distant and silent before, now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, reflecting something I could no longer ignore. The symbol of the turned hourglass on the board now seemed to be a reflection of my own existence. The game was beyond mere play. It had taken me to a place where I no longer knew if I was playing or if I was being played. And then came the final question. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't a sensation, but a certainty that invaded my mind, as if the game itself had summoned those words. The question hung in the air, heavy, relentless. Do you accept what you see? I swallowed dryly, but I couldn't answer. What did I see? The reflection that was no longer mine, the room that seemed to disintegrate into a space of shadows and light, the board that controlled me, the feeling that my very soul was being taken, piece by piece, and replaced with something I couldn't comprehend. Did I have control? Or had the game already consumed me entirely, making me part of a plot I should have never started? The question had no easy answer. How could I accept that? How could I accept what was before me, what I was seeing, what I was feeling? When the line between the real and the unreal became increasingly thin, almost non-existent, I knew the game had reached its most critical point, and the answer I gave now could be the last one I had to decide my fate. But how could I accept something that terrified me to the core of my being? How could I accept that everything I knew, everything I believed to be real, was crumbling before me? The mirror now reflected more than my face. It reflected my essence, my fears, my nightmares. And for a moment, I found myself questioning, if the reflection was no longer mine, what was left of me? And the answer, though unspoken, echoed in my mind. I didn't know if I wanted to accept it. I didn't know if I could. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The question hung in the air like an unbearable weight. And no matter how hard I tried to form words, my mind was clouded, empty. Doubt consumed me. How could I respond to that? How could I accept something I didn't understand, something beyond any reason or logic? I simply couldn't. And yet, the mirror broke on its own. The sound of the glass cracking was so sudden, so terrifying, that I almost didn't have time to react. It was as if the mirror itself had shattered into 1,000 pieces, as if it was no longer able to sustain the distorted reflection of me. Each shard, each piece of glass, floated in the air for a moment, reflecting a part of me, but none of them were exactly real. I saw my face in fragments, scattered pieces of an image that seemed to have been ripped from me and divided, with each part showing me something different. My eyes were there, but they weren't mine. My smile was there, but it wasn't mine. The reflection was familiar, but not enough. I no longer recognized myself. With every shard that fell, with every fragment that touched the ground, the room became colder, emptier. The mirror, which had once seemed to imprison me, was now shattered. But the feeling of being watched did not disappear. On the contrary, it intensified, as if the pieces of glass, now scattered around the room, were watching me, judging me in an impersonal, impartial way. Every little piece of glass was a fragment of me, but none was truly me. And then, silence took over the room. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It was a dense, oppressive silence, as if time itself had stopped, as if the world around me had suspended its breath. The absence of sound was so complete that I could almost hear the pulse of my own heart, beating hard in my chest, resonating like a distant echo. What happened? I was alone, but I wasn't. I was in an empty space, surrounded by fragments of a broken reflection, and I no longer knew where reality ended and the illusion began. The mirror had shattered, but its presence still lingered in the air, as if the very act of breaking was just another way of trapping me, another way of showing me that I would never have control, that I would never understand what was happening. The room seemed to shrink, as if the walls were closing in around me, thickening the air, making it hard to breathe. The weight of the situation crushed me, and I felt like I was sinking, slowly, into an abyss where reality was dissolving. That silence seemed to be devouring me from within, and I no longer knew what to do. I was trapped not just in the room, but within myself, within that distortion. The mirror no longer reflected anything. Nothing was what it seemed to be. What was left of me? What was left of everything I had known? And then, amidst the silence and the chaos of my mind, an idea, a certainty, formed. The mirror hadn't just broken. It had freed itself, and now I no longer knew if I was seeing my own reflection, or if, in fact, I was the puppet of what I had always feared. From the midst of the shards, something crawled. It wasn't large, nor imposing. It was small, fragile, but with such an unmistakable presence that it seemed to fill the entire space around it. What emerged from the glass fragments was not human, but its eyes. Those eyes were unmistakably human, as if something, or someone, was trapped there within that deformed body. It crawled across the shards with restless, uncoordinated movements, as if trying to break free, as if the pain of existing in that state was unbearable. Its eyes, dark and deep, fixed on me for an eternal moment, staring at me coldly, relentlessly. There was nothing alive in those eyes, nothing familiar, just an emptiness that reflected back my own helplessness. I should have screamed. I should have done something, but I was frozen. I couldn't move, as if something inside me had been frozen, as if the air around me had become too heavy for me to breathe. The gaze of that being, those human eyes, pierced me cruelly. I was being watched by something that did not belong to my reality, something that had detached itself from a place where rules did not exist, where reflections were not confined to mirrors. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the being disappeared. It hid beneath the door, like a shadow fleeing from the light. The sound of its tiny feet scratching the floor was the only trace of its existence, a sound that blended with the heavy silence that had overtaken the room. I stood there motionless, staring at the place where it had disappeared, my body still frozen, as if time had slowed down around me. Minutes dragged on, or maybe hours. I no longer knew. The world beyond those walls seemed distant, irrelevant. I could no longer distinguish what was real. Those images, those visions, were becoming increasingly intense, as if I were sinking into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The board, now cracked, was empty. The pieces that once moved restlessly were gone, as if the game had ended. There were no more clues, no more answers, only the overwhelming sense that something had changed, something irreversible. The cracks in the wood of the board mirrored the same fragmentation spreading through my mind, and the mirror that had already shattered, now seemed more like an opening to an abyss, a portal to something I couldn't comprehend. I looked at the place where the being had disappeared, and a sense of emptiness took over me. It wasn't just the room that was empty. I was too. I had lost something, perhaps a part of myself, perhaps my very humanity, and somehow I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to destroy everything. With every movement, a desperate attempt to erase what had begun, to eradicate the evil that had nested in my life. With anger and fear, I burned the board. The flames devoured the black glass pieces and the symbols, but even when the fire consumed them until they turned to ash, something told me it wouldn't be enough. I buried the pieces, hid every fragment, every piece of wood that still remembered the presence of the game. I tried to erase the memories, but I couldn't. The weight of it was with me, clinging to my skin, as if I could no longer escape it. I threw the mirror away, dragged it to the back of the yard, and tossed it into the river. I thought that, if I distanced it enough, maybe the curse would break. But I knew that nothing breaks like that, not after something so deep. Even so, I made the effort. The reflection, the figure, the shadow, everything that remained of me, seemed to fade away each time I tried to take an action. I was going against something that couldn't be touched, something beyond me. But every night, at 3 a.m., the scene repeated itself. I woke up with a start, the air heavy, the room immersed in the suffocating silence I had learned to fear. The candle, that purple candle that seemed to have a life of its own, was lit again, exactly in the same place, as if nothing had happened, as if all of it was part of an inevitable cycle. The flame flickered slightly, as if something was breathing near it, waiting. The die. The die was there, alone, sitting on the board. And then, with a terrifying softness, it spun. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an accident. It was something else. Something I couldn't control. The die spun for a long moment, as if preparing to decide my fate, as if it had a life of its own. And when it finally stopped, it landed on the number 1. It was always the number 1. Always. The weight of it hit me. I could no longer rationalize. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. There were no more logical explanations, no more control. Something I couldn't see, something I didn't understand, was watching me, manipulating me. I tried to escape it. I tried to destroy everything. But the rules had been set, and there was no going back. I didn't know what to do anymore. Each night was the same as the one before. The candle lit, the die spinning on its own. The number 1, always, like a constant repetition, an endless condemnation. I couldn't escape anymore. I couldn't fight anymore. And somewhere, deep in my mind, I knew the game had never ended. It was just waiting for me to accept it. I don't know how long he's been there, but I can feel his presence every day, in every corner, in every mirror. Sometimes, when I pass in front of one, I have the sensation that he's waiting for me, as if he's more alive than I am. He's no longer just a mere copy of me. He's something distinct, with a will of his own. Something that feeds on my anxiety, my uncertainty. He follows me. Sometimes he moves before I do. It's not just a quick movement like a blink of an eye. No, he seems to anticipate, as if he already knows what I'm going to do, as if I were a puppet and he, the one controlling the strings. My reflection in the mirror shifts a second before I move. With an almost supernatural precision, I see the movement, but I can't react. He's already one step ahead, and I stand there, frozen, questioning whether I moved or if it was him. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the reflection of him. Other times he smiles when I don't smile. A cold, distorted smile, as if it were silent mockery. It's not the smile I would give. It's not my joy. But he smiles, and I stand there, frozen, wondering what he knows that I don't. He's entertained, as if he's in control, as if he's waiting for me to finally understand the truth that escapes me every day. Every one of his smiles is a promise, and it's a threat. He knows more than I do. He's challenging me, pushing me towards something I can't comprehend. I know he's waiting for something. With every movement I make, every step, he's watching, calculating, as if waiting for the perfect moment to make his move, as if I were the piece, and he, the player. He doesn't act in a hurry, doesn't rush. He knows that, eventually, I'll give in, I'll lose. He's testing me, guiding me down a path I can no longer escape. I know the game isn't over yet, even though I've tried to escape, even though I've destroyed the board, buried the pieces, moved the mirrors away. None of it matters. The reflection is still there. It's always been there. It never left me. And somehow, I feel that the game never had an end. He always knew I couldn't win. He always knew that in the end, he would be the one who won. I just didn't know that until now. The reflection smiles again. And this time, I know he's waiting. I know that no matter how much I try to escape, I can't run from him. He is part of me. There are no doubts. There are no second chances. Burn everything. The pieces, the board, the booklet, everything. It doesn't matter how innocent it seems. It doesn't matter how old or exotic it appears. Burn it until nothing remains, until the fire consumes its essence, because what is in it is not something that can be controlled. The game starts slowly, like a breeze you don't notice until you're swept away by it. But soon you'll be in it, and there will be no escape. If you hear about it, run. Don't try to understand. Don't approach. Don't investigate. Don't ask anyone. What people say about it isn't just a rumor. It's a warning. A silent caution hidden in the shadows. The game comes for you, even if you don't look for it. It finds you. It always finds you. You can try to ignore it. You can try to convince yourself that it's all a lie, that it's just a superstition. But it knows where you are. It knows who you are. And believe me, it never forgets. And if one day your reflection blinks before you, It's already too late. When that happens, you will know. You will know that the game is already in progress, that you are part of it, that the line between the real and the unreal has already dissolved. Your reflection will no longer be just a reflection. It will watch you. It will imitate you, but in a strange way, as if it's ahead of you, as if it's always preparing to take your place. From that moment on, you will no longer be in control. What comes next is something that cannot be stopped, a force that will pull you down a path with no end. And when you realize this, when you understand that the game already has you, it will be too late. Because there is no going back. There is no escaping. You will just be a piece on a board that never ends, in a story that repeats itself night after night, reflecting the same question. Do you accept what you see? If you find this board, if you hear about it, or if one day your reflection blinks before you, then it's already too late, and you will never be the same.